In the annals of human history, few deaths have been as horrifying, as gruesome, or as symbolically appropriate as the final days of Herod the Great. The king who built monuments to his own glory, who murdered his own children out of paranoia, who ordered the massacre of innocents. This man did not die peacefully in his sleep. No, his end was something far more terrible. Imagine a death so excruciating that even the hardened servants who had witnessed countless executions could not bear to remain in the room. Picture a body decaying while the heart still beat, flesh rotting away while consciousness remained. This is not fiction, this is not myth, this is the documented historical end of one of the ancient world's most feared rulers. Herod the Great ruled Judea from 37 BCE until his death in 4 BCE, a reign marked by architectural grandeur and unspeakable cruelty. He expanded the Second Temple in Jerusalem into one of the wonders of the ancient world. He built fortresses, palaces, and entire cities. Yet this same man executed his favorite wife, Mariamne, along with her mother and 2 of his own sons. The Roman Emperor Augustus reportedly said it was better to be Herod's pig than his son, a dark joke referencing the fact that as a Jew, Herod wouldn't eat pork, but he had no qualms about killing his children. This was a man who ruled through terror, who saw conspiracies everywhere, who trusted no one, and in the end, his body betrayed him in ways that mirrored the corruption of his soul. The disease that claimed Herod began subtly, as these things often do. Perhaps a pain in his abdomen that wouldn't go away, a fever that came and went, but soon the symptoms became impossible to ignore. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, provides us with the most detailed account of Herod's final illness. Josephus had access to court records and eyewitness testimonies. His description is clinical in its precision, yet horrifying in its implications. What he describes is a death that seems almost too terrible to be real, yet multiple sources corroborate the essential facts. Herod's body, the vessel that had carried him to power and glory, became his prison and his torture chamber. Modern medical historians have attempted to diagnose Herod's condition based on the ancient descriptions. The symptoms suggest a combination of diseases, possibly including chronic kidney disease, Fournier's gangrene, and complications from what might have been diabetes or cancer. But the exact medical terminology matters less than understanding what Herod actually experienced. This was not a quick death. This was not even a death that came after a brief illness. This was a prolonged deterioration that lasted weeks, possibly months. Every day brought new horrors, new levels of pain, new degradations. And through it all, Herod remained conscious, aware of what was happening to his body, unable to escape the prison of his own flesh. The political context of Herod's final days adds another layer to this tragedy. He was a king without an heir he could trust. He had executed so many family members that the succession was in chaos. His paranoia had not diminished with age. If anything, it had intensified. Even as his body failed, his mind churned with plots and counterplots. He issued orders for executions even from his sickbed. He changed his will multiple times, never certain whom to favor, whom to destroy. The kingdom he had built with such ruthless efficiency was crumbling, and he knew it. The legacy he had fought so hard to create was turning to dust even before his death. And still, his body continued its slow, agonizing decomposition. Understanding Herod's death requires us to look beyond the mere medical facts. This was a man who had styled himself as almost divine, who had built temples and monuments that were meant to last forever. He had commissioned coins with his image, had named cities after his patrons, had tried to make himself immortal through architecture and politics. Yet in the end, he was reduced to something less than human, a rotting, stinking mass of diseased flesh. The psychological horror of this must have been profound. To have been so powerful and to end so powerless, to have controlled the fates of thousands and to lose control over one's own body. This was not just death, this was humiliation on a cosmic scale. The ancient world did not have our modern squeamishness about bodily functions and decay. Death was a visible, everyday reality. People saw corpses regularly. They understood disease and decomposition in ways we, with our sanitized modern lives, do not. Yet even by the standards of the ancient world, Herod's death was remarkable for its horror. Josephus describes it in detail, not to sensationalize, but because it was genuinely extraordinary. Even hardened soldiers and experienced physicians were shocked by what they witnessed. The servants who had to tend to Herod's rotting body must have experienced nightmares for the rest of their lives. This was a death that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human suffering. As we explore the details of Herod's final days, we must prepare ourselves for descriptions that are genuinely disturbing. This is not entertainment. This is history. Dark, uncomfortable history, but history nonetheless. We owe it to the truth to not flinch away from the reality of what happened. Herod's death serves as a stark reminder that power, wealth, and glory cannot protect us from the fundamental vulnerability of being human. No matter how high we rise, we all return to dust. But some journeys to that final destination are far more terrible than others. Herod's journey was one of the most terrible in recorded history, and now we will walk that journey with him, step by terrible step, into the darkness of his final days. The king at his zenith. To understand the full tragedy and horror of Herod's death, we must first understand who he was at the height of his power. Herod the Great was not born to royalty. His father, Antipater, was an Idumean, a people who had been forcibly converted to Judaism just a generation earlier. This meant that Herod, despite his position, was never fully accepted by the Jewish elite he ruled. He was an outsider, a half-Jew in their eyes, a puppet of Rome who sat on a throne that should have belonged to someone of pure Davidic lineage. This fundamental insecurity would shape every decision Herod made throughout his reign. It would drive his paranoia, fuel his cruelty, and ultimately contribute to the isolation that made his final days so utterly desolate. Herod came to power in 37 BCE after a brutal civil war. The previous ruler, Antigonus, was executed by the Romans at Herod's request, beheaded with an axe, a particularly humiliating form of execution reserved for slaves and rebels. Herod had learned early that power in the ancient world required not just political skill, but absolute ruthlessness. He cultivated relationships with the most powerful Romans of his day, first with Mark Antony, then, after Antony's defeat, with Octavian, who became Augustus Caesar. This ability to switch allegiances at precisely the right moment showed a political acumen that few of his contemporaries possessed. He was a survivor, a man who could read the currents of power and position himself accordingly. But survival came at a cost. The constant need to prove his loyalty, to demonstrate his usefulness, to show that he was more valuable alive than dead. The Herod of his prime was a formidable figure. Contemporary descriptions suggest he was physically imposing, skilled in warfare, and possessed of tremendous energy. He could ride for days without rest, could personally lead troops into battle, could oversee construction projects that would have overwhelmed lesser men. His building projects were staggering in their ambition and scale. The expansion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem transformed a modest structure into one of the most magnificent buildings in the Roman world. The artificial harbor at Caesarea Maritima was an engineering marvel, using a type of hydraulic cement that allowed construction underwater. Masada, perched on an isolated rock plateau, became a fortress palace that seemed to defy the laws of nature. These were not merely buildings, they were statements of power, declarations of permanence, attempts to carve his name into eternity itself. Yet even at the height of his power, Herod was never secure. The Jewish population he ruled viewed him with suspicion at best, hatred at worst. They saw his building projects not as gifts, but as vanity, his loyalty to Rome not as political necessity, but as betrayal of their traditions. Herod tried to win their favor through generosity. During a famine, he melted down his own gold to buy grain from Egypt. He reduced taxes during times of hardship. He sponsored public works that provided employment. But none of it worked. The fundamental problem remained. He was not one of them, not really, and no amount of generosity could change that fact. This rejection festered in him, creating a wound that never healed. It made him suspicious of everyone, convinced that plots against him were constantly being hatched, certain that his own family members were scheming to take his throne. The paranoia manifested most tragically in his treatment of his family. Herod married 10 times, producing numerous children, but he could trust none of them. His favorite wife, Mariamne, came from the Hasmonean dynasty, the previous royal family of Judea. Through her, Herod hoped to legitimize his rule, to connect himself to the ancient lineages that the Jews respected. He was genuinely in love with her, as much as a man like Herod could love anyone, but even love could not overcome his suspicion. When rumors reached him, likely false, possibly planted by enemies, that Mariamne was plotting against him, he had her executed. The ancient sources tell us he went mad with grief afterward, calling out her name, demanding that servants bring her to him, unable to accept that he had killed the one person he truly loved. This was the first great tragedy that would prefigure his ultimate fate, destroying with his own hands what he cherished most. After Mariamne's death, the executions multiplied. Her mother, Alexandra, was killed. His sons by Mariamne, Alexander and Aristobulus, were accused of treason. Despite their protestations of innocence, despite the lack of solid evidence, Herod had them strangled. The executions sent shockwaves through the region. These were not enemies or rebels. These were his own children, young men with families of their own, killed because Herod's paranoia had convinced him they posed a threat. Augustus Caesar, upon hearing of these executions, reportedly made his famous quip about preferring to be Herod's pig than his son. It was a joke, but it contained a terrible truth. Herod had become a monster who devoured his own children. And like all monsters, he would eventually turn his violence inward onto himself. The Gospel of Matthew contains the famous story of the massacre of the innocents. Herod's order to kill all male children under 2 years old in Bethlehem. Whether this specific incident occurred as described is debated by historians, as no contemporary Roman or Jewish source mentions it. However, the story is entirely consistent with Herod's character and methods. When he felt threatened, he eliminated threats with brutal efficiency, caring nothing for collateral damage. The historical Herod killed enough people, destroyed enough families, caused enough suffering that the gospel story, even if not literally true, captures a deeper truth about who he was. He was a man capable of ordering the death of children. He was a man who would sacrifice any number of innocent lives to preserve his own power. And in the end, this same man would be unable to end his own suffering, forced to endure a fate worse than any he had inflicted on others. As Herod aged, probably in his early 60s by the time his final illness struck, he showed no signs of mellowing. If anything, his cruelty intensified. His court was a place of constant intrigue and danger. Sons plotted against fathers, brothers against brothers, wives against each other. Herod encouraged this atmosphere, believing that keeping everyone at each other's throats prevented them from uniting against him. He was right, in a sense. No one could organize a successful coup when they were too busy defending themselves from accusations and counter-accusations. But the price was terrible. He lived surrounded by family, yet utterly alone. No one loved him. Not really. Some feared him, others hated him. A few saw him as useful. But love, that had died with Mariamne, if it had ever truly existed at all. And so, when the disease began to take hold, when his body started its slow journey toward horror, Herod faced it as he had lived, alone, suspicious, afraid, and desperately clinging to a power that was already slipping through his fingers like sand. The first symptoms. The exact timing of Herod's final illness is difficult to pinpoint with precision, but most historians place its beginning sometime in late 5 BCE or early 4 BCE. The first symptoms were probably subtle enough that Herod dismissed them. A man who had lived through wars, assassination attempts, and political upheavals was not going to be concerned about a stomachache or a slight fever. In the ancient world, minor ailments were commonplace, and the powerful had access to the best physicians available. Herod's court included doctors trained in Greek medicine, practitioners who understood the theories of Hippocrates and Galen. They would have examined him, prescribed various remedies, assured him that this was nothing serious. They had no way of knowing that they were watching the beginning of something unprecedented, a deterioration that would shock even experienced medical practitioners with its severity and horror. The early symptoms, according to Josephus's account, included a persistent low fever. This was not the high fever of acute infection, but rather a constant, draining warmth that left Herod feeling perpetually unwell. Ancient medicine had limited understanding of what caused fevers, attributing them to imbalances in the body's humors. The physicians would have tried various treatments: bloodletting to remove excess blood, special diets to restore balance, herbal remedies to cool the fever. None of it would have worked because the underlying problem was far beyond their ability to treat. Modern analysis suggests the fever might have been caused by systemic infection, possibly originating in the kidneys or intestines. Whatever the source, it was a warning sign, the body's desperate attempt to fight off something that had gone terribly wrong inside it. Alongside the fever came an intense, unbearable itching. Josephus describes this itching as affecting Herod's entire body, but particularly severe in certain areas. This was not the mild irritation of dry skin or an insect bite. This was a maddening sensation that drove Herod to scratch himself until he bled. Servants tried to help, applying oils and ointments, but nothing provided relief. The itching would wake him from sleep, would interrupt conversations and meetings, would consume his attention until he could think of nothing else. Modern medical experts suggest this symptom indicates uremia, a buildup of waste products in the blood that occurs when the kidneys fail. The toxins accumulate in the skin, causing an itching so intense that patients have been known to tear their own flesh trying to find relief. Herod was experiencing the first stages of his body poisoning itself, his own blood becoming toxic as his organs began to fail. Then came the pain in his abdomen. At first it was occasional, easily dismissed as indigestion or the result of a rich meal, but it grew progressively worse, becoming a constant ache that intensified into sharp, stabbing pains. Herod, who had endured battle wounds without complaint, found himself doubling over in agony. The pain was located deep in his lower abdomen and groin, radiating outward in waves. His physicians were baffled. They tried various treatments: warm compresses, herbal poultices, special diets that eliminated certain foods. Nothing helped. In fact, the pain only intensified as weeks passed. What the doctors could not know was that they were witnessing the early stages of massive tissue death. Somewhere deep inside Herod's body, flesh was beginning to die and rot while he still lived. The pain was his body's alarm system, desperately trying to signal that something catastrophic was happening, but there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Herod's appetite disappeared. Food that once appealed to him now seemed repulsive. When he forced himself to eat, his stomach rebelled, causing nausea and vomiting. He began to lose weight at an alarming rate. His face, once full and commanding, became gaunt. His clothes hung loosely on a frame that seemed to shrink day by day. The court whispered about the king's condition. Was he dying? Should they begin positioning themselves for whatever came next? But Herod still held power, still issued orders, still had enemies executed. Even weakened, he was dangerous. The fear he had cultivated throughout his reign now served him well. No one dared openly discuss succession. No one dared appear too eager for his death. They waited, watched, and whispered, while Herod's body continued its terrible transformation. As his physical condition deteriorated, Herod's mental state became increasingly unstable. The paranoia that had always been part of his character intensified into something approaching madness. He saw plots everywhere. Innocent conversations were interpreted as conspiracies. Family members were accused of treason on the basis of rumors and suspicions. His son, Antipater, who had been maneuvering for succession, found himself under investigation. Herod was convinced that Antipater was trying to poison him, to accelerate his death so he could seize the throne. The accusation may actually have had some truth to it. Succession crises in the ancient world often led to such attempts. But whether Antipater was guilty or not, Herod's reaction shows how the disease was affecting not just his body, but his mind. He was becoming isolated, unable to trust anyone, surrounded by potential enemies, both real and imagined. The physicians were now deeply worried. Whatever was afflicting the king, it was beyond their experience. They consulted ancient texts, sought advice from colleagues, tried increasingly desperate remedies. Some suggested the cause was supernatural, a curse from the gods, or punishment for some offense. Others maintained it was purely physical, a disease of the body that medicine could cure if only they could identify the right treatment. They prescribed everything from special diets to magical amulets. Herod, desperate for relief from the constant fever, itching and pain, tried them all. Nothing worked. Each day brought new symptoms, new horrors. The disease was progressing, moving from uncomfortable to unbearable, from concerning to catastrophic, and the worst was yet to come. By the time several weeks had passed, it was clear that this was not an ordinary illness. Herod was not getting better. He was getting worse, and the rate of decline was accelerating. The fever never broke, the itching intensified. The abdominal pain became so severe that Herod could barely move without crying out. His legs began to swell, the skin stretching tight over fluid-filled tissue. This edema, as modern medicine would call it, was another sign of kidney failure. The body was no longer able to properly manage fluid, which accumulated in the tissues, causing painful swelling. Herod's feet became so enlarged that he could no longer wear his normal sandals. His legs looked grotesquely bloated, the skin shiny and taut. When pressure was applied, it left an indentation that slowly filled back in, a classic sign of severe edema. The king who had once strode confidently through his palace now could barely walk. His body was betraying him in the most fundamental ways, and this was only the beginning of his ordeal. The disease takes hold. As winter approached in the year 5 BCE, Herod's condition entered a new and horrifying phase. The symptoms that had been merely unbearable now crossed into territory that even experienced physicians found shocking. Josephus's account becomes particularly detailed at this point, suggesting that the horror of what was happening compelled him to document it thoroughly. The swelling in Herod's lower body, which had begun in his legs, now spread upward. His abdomen distended, filled with fluid that made him look obscenely pregnant, but it was what was happening to his genitals that marked the true beginning of his nightmare. The tissue in his groin area began to swell massively, becoming inflamed and discolored. This was not simple edema, this was the beginning of tissue death on a massive scale. Modern medical experts examining the ancient descriptions believe Herod was suffering from a condition called Fournier's gangrene, a rare but devastating form of necrotizing fasciitis that affects the genital area. In this condition, bacteria invade the deep tissue layers, multiplying rapidly and producing toxins that kill tissue faster than the body can respond. The blood supply to the affected area is cut off, and without blood, tissue dies. Dead tissue provides perfect conditions for bacterial growth, creating a vicious cycle. The condition spreads rapidly, sometimes progressing inches per hour, literally eating through flesh. In the ancient world, without antibiotics or modern surgical techniques, Fournier's gangrene was essentially a death sentence. But it was not a quick death. The process could take weeks or even months, and throughout that time, the victim remained conscious and aware of what was happening to their body. The visible signs of the disease were horrifying. Herod's genital area, once swollen, began to develop dark patches, areas where the skin was dying. These patches grew darker and larger each day, turning from red to purple to black as the tissue necrotized. The skin became fragile, breaking open to reveal the rotting flesh beneath. The pain must have been indescribable. Nerve endings were being destroyed, but not quickly enough. Herod experienced the full agony of his flesh decomposing while he still lived. He could not sit without pain. He could not lie down comfortably. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his body. His physicians could do nothing but offer ineffective pain relief, perhaps opium or wine, neither of which was strong enough to dull suffering of this magnitude. Then came the smell. As tissue dies and rots, it produces a distinctive odor, the smell of putrefaction, of decay. It is not merely unpleasant, it is a smell that triggers a primal disgust response in humans, an evolutionary warning that we are in the presence of death and disease. In Herod's case, the smell became overwhelming. Josephus specifically mentions that the stench emanating from Herod's body was so intense that it filled his chambers and made it difficult for anyone to remain near him. Servants gagged and fled. Physicians had to wrap cloth around their faces to approach him. Even Herod's family members, accustomed to holding their noses in the presence of death and disease, found the smell unbearable. This was no ordinary sickroom odor. This was the smell of a living man whose body had begun to rot while he still breathed. The psychological impact of this horror on Herod cannot be overstated. He had built his entire life around power and control. He had conquered kingdoms, built monuments, shaped the political landscape of his entire region. Now he could not even control his own body. He was forced to lie in his own filth, unable to move without assistance, dependent on servants who could barely stand to be near him. The proud king had been reduced to an object of revulsion. When he caught sight of himself, in polished metal mirrors perhaps, or reflected in water, he must have recoiled from what he saw. The face looking back was barely recognizable. Gaunt, yellowed from jaundice, eyes sunken and hollow, the features of a dying man. And below, hidden from sight but impossible to forget, his body was literally falling apart, decomposing piece by piece while his heart still beat and his mind remained trapped inside this failing flesh. Herod's physicians were now in a state of panic. Nothing in their training had prepared them for this. Greek medical theory focused on balancing humors, treating symptoms with various herbs and procedures. But here was a disease that seemed to defy all logic, that progressed despite every treatment attempted. Some physicians began to whisper that this was divine punishment, that the gods, whether the Jewish god or the Greek pantheon, had cursed Herod for his crimes. How else to explain such a horrific affliction? The idea was not entirely superstitious. In the ancient world, the line between medicine and religion was blurred. Disease was often seen as moral as well as physical, and Herod's crimes were so numerous, so terrible, that it seemed fitting that his punishment should be equally extreme. Whether or not divine intervention was involved, the result was the same. Herod was experiencing hell on earth, and there was no escape. The disease continued its relentless progress. New symptoms appeared almost daily. Herod developed difficulty breathing as fluid accumulated in his lungs, pulmonary edema, a consequence of his failing kidneys and heart. Each breath was labored, wheezing, painful. He developed ulcers in his intestines, causing bloody diarrhea that further weakened him and added to the indignity of his condition. His skin broke out in lesions and sores that oozed pus. His tongue swelled, making speech difficult. He drooled constantly, unable to control the saliva that ran down his chin. Every system in his body was failing simultaneously. It was as if the very fabric of his physical being was unraveling, coming apart at the seams. And through it all, his mind remained clear enough to understand what was happening, to experience every moment of degradation and horror, to know that he was dying in the most terrible way imaginable. The worms, what came next, represents the absolute nadir of human suffering, the detail that makes Herod's death unique in the annals of recorded history. Josephus reports with clinical precision that Herod's genital area became infested with worms. The Greek word used is skolekes, specifically referring to maggots or larvae. These were not metaphorical worms representing disease. These were actual living organisms, feeding on Herod's rotting flesh while he still lived. Modern readers might wonder if this is exaggeration, if ancient writers were prone to dramatic embellishment. But medical experts confirm that this symptom is entirely consistent with advanced Fournier's gangrene. When tissue dies and begins to rot, flies are attracted to the odor of decay. They lay eggs in the dead flesh, and these eggs hatch into larvae, maggots, that feed on the necrotic tissue. The horrifying reality is that Herod's body had become a breeding ground for insects while he was still alive. The presence of maggots in a wound is not always a bad thing. Modern medicine has rediscovered maggot therapy, using specially bred sterile maggots to clean wounds by eating dead tissue while leaving living tissue untouched. But Herod's case was nothing like controlled medical treatment. These were wild maggots, feeding on an open, festering wound in one of the most sensitive areas of the human body. The sensation must have been beyond description. Imagine feeling movement, constant, squirming movement in your most intimate areas. Imagine being unable to remove them, unable to stop their feeding, unable to do anything but endure the knowledge that your body was being consumed by parasites. The psychological horror rivals the physical pain. This was not just disease. This was violation on the most fundamental level. Herod's body had ceased to be his own and had become food for creatures at the bottom of the natural hierarchy. The physicians attempted to remove the maggots. They tried picking them out manually, using implements to scrape them away, but the maggots were embedded deep in the rotting tissue, and removing them often tore away flesh, causing fresh bleeding and pain. Moreover, new flies continued to lay eggs. As quickly as maggots were removed, new ones appeared. The physicians were fighting a losing battle. The very nature of the wound, open, filled with dead tissue, producing the sweet, rotten smell of decay, made it irresistible to flies. In the warm climate of Jericho, where Herod had retreated, flies were abundant. There was no way to keep them away from the dying king. Fine netting might have helped, but even this was not completely effective. The flies found their way in, drawn by an evolutionary imperative to lay their eggs in places where their offspring could feed and grow. Herod's body was perfect for their purposes, if unspeakably terrible for his. The infestation spread. What had begun in the genital area extended to other parts of Herod's body where the flesh had broken down. His rectum, damaged by ulceration and constant diarrhea, became infested. Wounds on his legs and abdomen attracted flies. Herod was being eaten alive, piece by piece, by the smallest and most contemptible of creatures. For a man who had once commanded armies, who had received embassies from foreign kings, who had built monuments that would last centuries, this was the ultimate degradation. He was reduced to something less than human, a piece of rotting meat that served as an incubator for maggots. The servants who had to clean him or attempt to were traumatized by what they witnessed. Some refused to continue and were replaced, only for the new servants to also flee after seeing the reality of Herod's condition. Modern medical understanding makes Herod's plight even more poignant when we realize that he was likely experiencing something called delusional parasitosis, the sensation that insects are crawling on or under the skin. This condition can occur with kidney failure, as toxins build up in the blood and affect the nervous system. But in Herod's case, the parasites were not delusional. They were terribly, horrifyingly real. He was experiencing both the actual infestation and the heightened sensory perception that made him acutely aware of every movement, every sensation. His nerves, damaged but not dead, transmitted constant signals of violation to his brain. There was no moment of peace, no second of relief. Every moment of consciousness was filled with the awareness of what was happening to his body. The spiritual and religious implications of this infestation were not lost on observers. In Jewish tradition, ritual purity was paramount. Contact with dead flesh made one unclean. Herod, while alive, had become a source of ritual impurity. He was simultaneously living and dead, a walking corpse. Priests could not approach him. Religious ceremonies could not be performed in his presence. In a very real sense, he had been cut off from his community and from God. The Jewish concept of Sheol, the realm of the dead, was described as a place of worms and decay. Herod was experiencing Sheol while still technically alive. Whether one believes in divine judgment or not, the symbolism is stark. The man who had tried to make himself great, who had built monuments to his own glory, had been reduced to the most abject state imaginable. If there were a god orchestrating this fate, it was the ultimate illustration of how the mighty are brought low. Herod's mental state during this phase is difficult to imagine. The sources report periods of delirium, times when he seemed not to recognize those around him or understand where he was. This may have been a mercy, brief escapes from consciousness during which he was not fully aware of his torment. But there were also periods of terrible lucidity when he understood exactly what was happening. During these moments, witnesses reported that he screamed, not in pain, though the pain was certainly immense, but in rage and despair. He raged against fate, against the gods, against his own body. He had been a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through force of will and power. Now his will meant nothing, his power meant nothing. He could not command the maggots to leave his body. He could not order his flesh to heal. He was helpless in a way he had never been helpless before, and the psychological anguish of this helplessness may have exceeded even the physical suffering. As days turned into weeks, the infestation continued. The maggots completed their life cycle, dropping away to pupae, only to be replaced by new generations. Herod's body had become an ecosystem, a habitat for creatures that fed on death. The physicians, still attending despite the horror, could only watch and try to manage symptoms. They could not cure. They could not even significantly ease his suffering. Pain management in the ancient world was primitive. Opium might dull the senses somewhat, but not enough. Wine might provide brief moments of oblivion, but Herod's damaged digestive system could barely tolerate liquids. He was trapped in full consciousness of his ordeal, unable to escape either through medication or through the mercy of death. His body, despite its catastrophic failure, clung stubbornly to life. His heart kept beating, his lungs kept drawing breath, and the worms kept feeding, consuming him piece by piece in one of the most terrible deaths ever recorded in human history. Political machinations from a deathbed. Even as his body rotted around him, Herod remained consumed by the same paranoia and political cunning that had defined his reign. A lesser man might have surrendered to his fate, might have used his remaining time to make peace with enemies or reconcile with family. But Herod was not capable of such gestures. His mind, though increasingly affected by the toxins coursing through his blood, remained focused on power and succession. Who would inherit his kingdom? Who could be trusted? These questions tormented him as much as the physical agony of his disease. From his bed in Jericho, barely able to speak through his swollen tongue, unable to move without assistance, he continued to scheme, plot, and order executions. The dying king was perhaps more dangerous than the healthy one had ever been, because now he had nothing to lose and no reason to show restraint. His son Antipater had returned to Judea from Rome, where he had been cultivating relationships with Augustus Caesar. Antipater was Herod's eldest surviving son. So many others had been executed. He expected to inherit, believed the kingdom was rightfully his. But Herod had grown suspicious of his son. The paranoia that had never left him now blossomed into full certainty that Antipater was plotting to kill him, to accelerate the succession. Letters were produced, allegedly proving conspiracy. Witnesses testified to secret meetings and whispered conversations. Whether any of this was true is impossible to know. Given Herod's history of false accusations against family members, skepticism is warranted. But true or false hardly mattered. Herod believed it, and that belief was enough to seal Antipater's fate. He ordered his son arrested, imprisoned, held to await judgment. Antipater, who had thought himself on the verge of kingship, instead found himself in chains, accused of treason against his dying father. While Antipater sat in prison, Herod revised his will, then revised it again and again. Each version favored different sons, different potential heirs. His kingdom was divided and redivided on paper, territories allocated and reallocated according to Herod's shifting suspicions and momentary preferences. Archelaus, another son, was briefly favored. Then Herod Antipas, then Philip. The court watched these machinations with growing desperation. Which son should they support? Who would emerge victorious? The wrong choice could mean death once Herod finally died and the successor consolidated power. But there was no way to predict which son would ultimately prevail. Herod changed his mind too frequently, was too unpredictable. So the courtiers waited, positioned themselves as best they could, and hoped to survive the transition of power that was clearly coming soon, though not, it seemed, as soon as everyone hoped. In his more lucid moments, Herod must have understood that his kingdom was falling apart. He had worked so hard to build something that would outlast him, had constructed a political legacy through marriages, alliances, and careful management of relationships with Rome. Now, all of that work was unraveling. His sons were enemies to each other. His nobles were already dividing into factions. The Jewish population awaited his death with barely concealed eagerness, hoping that his successor might be less oppressive, less cruel. The stability he had maintained through fear was evaporating as that fear dissipated with the visible proof of his mortality. A dying king commands little respect, and a king dying in such a disgusting, humiliating manner commands even less. Herod could see his legacy crumbling even before his death, could see that the kingdom he had built would not survive him intact. This realization may have been worse than the physical pain, the knowledge that it had all been for nothing. Then Herod conceived of a plan so monstrous that it secured his reputation for cruelty even beyond his death. He knew that the Jewish people would celebrate his death. He knew that there would be public rejoicing, that his passing would be marked by festivities rather than mourning. This knowledge was unbearable to him. His ego, still intact despite his body's failure, could not tolerate the idea of his death being an occasion for happiness. So he issued a terrible command. He ordered that prominent Jews from throughout his kingdom be gathered in Jericho. The excuse was that they were needed for some governmental purpose. In reality, Herod was assembling hostages. He commanded his sister Salome and her husband Alexis that upon his death, these assembled Jews should be executed, all of them. Hundreds of the most prominent, respected members of Jewish society were to be slaughtered. Herod's reasoning was as coldly logical as it was horrifying. If the Jews would not mourn his death willingly, they would mourn their own dead. His funeral would be accompanied by lamentation one way or another. The order reveals the depths of Herod's narcissism and cruelty. He was willing to murder hundreds of innocent people simply to ensure that his death would not be celebrated. The victims had done nothing wrong. The last hope, Calleru. As Herod's condition continued to deteriorate, despite all attempts at treatment, his physicians suggested one final possibility. About 25 miles from Jericho, on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, lay the hot springs of Calleru. These springs were famous throughout the ancient world for their healing properties. The water emerged from the ground at nearly scalding temperatures, rich in minerals, and people traveled from great distances to bathe in them, seeking cures for various ailments. The physicians convinced Herod that if anything could heal him, it would be the miraculous waters of Calleru. It was a last hope, and Herod grasped at it with the desperation of a drowning man. The journey would be arduous, he could barely move, and the pain of any motion was excruciating. But remaining in Jericho meant certain death. At Calleru, there was at least a chance, so Herod gave the order he would go to Calleru. The logistics of moving a dying king in Herod's condition were nightmarish. He could not sit a horse. Walking was impossible. He had to be carried in a litter, surrounded by servants and guards. Every bump in the road sent waves of agony through his rotting body. The movement jostled his swollen abdomen, disturbed the maggots feeding on his flesh, caused fresh bleeding from his numerous open sores. The smell emanating from his litter was so intense that the bearers had to be rotated frequently. No one could stand close to him for long without gagging. The journey that might have taken a healthy person a day required several days for Herod's party. They moved slowly, carefully, stopping frequently for the king to rest, though rest brought no relief. Throughout the journey, Herod was in constant agony, crying out in pain, begging for relief that could not be given. His entourage could do nothing but continue forward, carrying their rotting king toward what everyone secretly knew was false hope. When they finally reached Calleru, preparations were made for Herod to bathe in the healing waters. The springs were indeed impressive, hot water cascading from rocks, creating pools of different temperatures. The air was thick with sulfurous steam. Other visitors to the springs, seeking cures for their own ailments, fled when they saw Herod's party approach. The sight of the dying king, and more importantly the smell, made it impossible for others to remain. The entire area around the springs was cleared. Herod was carried to one of the pools. Servants helped him into the water, a process that must have been agonizing as the heat touched his damaged flesh. The theory was that the hot water would cleanse the wounds, that the minerals would promote healing, that immersion in these legendary springs would accomplish what all other treatments had failed to do. It was magical thinking, but in the absence of any better option, it was all they had. The effect was catastrophic. As soon as Herod's body entered the hot water, he began to convulse. His eyes rolled back. He appeared to lose consciousness. The servants panicked, dragging him from the pool, certain he was dying. They laid him on the ground, where he gradually revived, but the experience had been traumatic. The heat, rather than healing, had shocked his system. His body, already failing, could not tolerate the temperature of the water. The pain had intensified rather than decreased. When he could speak again, Herod ordered that the attempt not be repeated. There would be no more bathing in the healing waters. The journey to Caliru had been for nothing. The last hope had failed. In that moment, Herod must have understood with absolute certainty that he was going to die, that no cure existed, that his fate was sealed. The psychological impact of this realization, the death of hope, may have been worse than any physical symptom. The failure at Caliru marked a turning point in Herod's psychological state. Up until then, he had maintained some hope, however slim, that he might recover. Now that hope was gone. He knew he was dying and that nothing could prevent it. This knowledge changed something in him. Some sources suggest he became more fatalistic, less concerned with the political machinations that had consumed him. Others indicate that his paranoia intensified, that he became even more suspicious and cruel, determined to take as many enemies with him as possible before the end. Both reactions may be true. Herod had always been a man of contradictions, capable of great building projects and great cruelty, simultaneously paranoid and calculating, feared and yet somehow effective as a ruler. In his final days, these contradictions became even more pronounced. He was a dying man who still commanded absolute power, a rotting corpse that could still order executions, a human being reduced to something less than human, yet still clinging to the trappings of kingship. The physicians, having exhausted all possibilities, could now only try to make him comfortable, but comfort was impossible. The pain was too intense, too constant. The degradation was too complete. Herod's body had become a prison from which there was no escape except death, and death was taking its time. Days passed, then weeks. Each day brought new horrors, new breakdowns of bodily function, new indignities. Herod had become a burden to everyone around him. The servants who had to attend him were traumatized by the experience. Family members visited out of duty but fled as soon as they could, unable to bear the sight and smell. Even physicians accustomed to disease and death found caring for Herod almost unbearable. The king had become an object of horror, a walking reminder of human mortality and vulnerability, a testament to the fact that wealth and power cannot protect us from the fundamental frailty of the flesh. In the quiet moments, when the pain subsided enough for thought, what did Herod think about? Did he reflect on his life, on his accomplishments and crimes? Did he feel remorse for the people he had killed, the suffering he had caused? Or did he remain defiant to the end, convinced that his actions had been necessary, that he had done what any strong ruler would do? We cannot know what passed through his mind in those final days. The sources tell us about his physical condition in excruciating detail, but give us only glimpses of his mental state. We know he was afraid. We know he was in pain. We know he remained suspicious and paranoid. Beyond that, the interior life of the dying Herod remains a mystery. But we can imagine, and what we imagine is terrible enough. A mind trapped in a failing body, full consciousness of unendurable suffering, and the certain knowledge that this is how it will end, not in glory, not with dignity, but in rot and stench and agony. This was the fate of Herod the Great. The journey to Caliru had been his last hope, and it had failed completely. Desperate measures. Back in Jericho, with all hope of recovery extinguished, Herod descended into the darkest phase of his ordeal. The pain had become so intense, so unremitting, that it consumed his entire existence. There were no longer moments of relief, no periods when he could distract himself with political business or even with thoughts of revenge. Every second of consciousness was filled with agony. Modern pain management uses sophisticated drugs, carefully calibrated doses, multiple approaches to interrupt pain signals. The ancient world had opium, wine, and herbal remedies that were woefully inadequate for suffering of this magnitude. Herod begged for stronger medication, for anything that might provide relief. His physicians had nothing more to offer. They had already given him as much opium as they dared. Any more might kill him. Though perhaps death would have been merciful at this point, the physicians could not take that responsibility. So Herod suffered, trapped in unending torment. In desperation, Herod attempted to take control of the one thing he could still control, the timing of his own death. Josephus reports that Herod tried to commit suicide. He called for a knife, ostensibly to peel an apple. Such was his condition that even this simple act required assistance. But his true intention was to use the knife on himself, to end his suffering through violence, since peaceful death refused to come. One of his attendants, either guessing his purpose or simply acting out of routine caution, took the knife away. Herod lunged for it, trying to grab the weapon, but his body was too weak. He could not even accomplish this final act. The commotion brought servants running. They restrained him, took away anything he might use to harm himself. Word spread quickly through the palace. The king had tried to kill himself. His desperation had driven him to attempt what his religion considered a grave sin. The suicide attempt had consequences beyond Herod's immediate chambers. His son, Antipater, imprisoned nearby and awaiting execution for alleged treason, heard the commotion. Servants were crying out that the king was dying, that he had tried to take his own life. Antipater, thinking his father was already dead, began celebrating. He called to his guards, tried to bribe them to release him, promised them rewards once he assumed the throne. The celebration was premature and foolish. Word of Antipater's reaction reached Herod almost immediately. The dying king, thwarted in his suicide attempt, now had his rage redirected toward his son. If Herod could not escape his suffering through death, he could at least ensure that his son would not profit from it. Despite being barely conscious, despite being in agony that should have made political decisions impossible, Herod gave one final order. Antipater was to be executed immediately. Not after Herod's death, immediately. Now. The execution order created a problem. Roman law required that no member of a royal family could be executed without the permission of the emperor. Herod technically needed to send word to Rome and wait for Augustus Caesar's approval before killing his son. But Herod was not going to wait. He knew he was dying, knew it could happen at any moment. He could not risk dying before seeing Antipater dead. So he gave the order without waiting for permission from Rome. Soldiers were dispatched to Antipater's cell. The young man, who moments before had been celebrating his imminent succession, was dragged out and executed. The method is not specified in the sources, perhaps beheading, perhaps strangling. It hardly matters. Antipater died just 5 days before his father, killed by a man who was himself already more than half dead, destroyed by paranoia that persisted even to the very end. It was Herod's final murder, the last act of cruelty in a life filled with them. After Antipater's execution, something seemed to break in Herod. Perhaps the act of killing his son released some psychological tension. Perhaps the exertion simply exhausted him. Whatever the reason, he entered his final decline. His body, which had been dying slowly for months, accelerated its deterioration. The swelling increased until his abdomen was grotesquely distended, tight as a drum. The skin stretched so thin it seemed it might split. His breathing became labored, each breath a wheezing struggle. The smell grew even worse, if such a thing were possible. The smell of gangrenous tissue, of purulent discharge, of a body in the advanced stages of decomposition. Servants had to burn incense constantly in his chambers, but it could not mask the odor. Anyone who entered had to steel themselves against the stench. Visitors reported that they could smell Herod before they reached his rooms, that the odor permeated the entire palace. Herod's lucidity came and went. There were periods when he seemed unaware of his surroundings, staring at nothing, occasionally crying out in pain or fear. Then he would snap back to awareness, would ask what was happening, would try to issue orders. His family gathered not out of love but out of necessity. Someone needed to be present when he died. Someone needed to witness the final moments so there could be no dispute about the succession. They watched from a distance, unable to bear being too close, waiting for the end. Herod must have known they were there, must have known they were waiting for him to die. Must have understood that no one mourned, that everyone was simply eager for it to be over. This knowledge, that he was utterly alone, unloved, unwanted in his final hours, may have been the final emotional torment to add to his physical suffering. The final days were marked by a series of terrible symptoms. Herod developed convulsions. His body would suddenly seize up, muscles contracting, limbs jerking. These episodes left him even more exhausted, if such a thing were possible. His fever spiked, leaving him drenched in sweat despite the cool weather. The sweat itself was foul-smelling, adding to the miasma that surrounded him. He could no longer control his bowels or bladder. He lay in his own waste, despite servants' efforts to keep him clean. The dignity of kingship had been completely stripped away. He was reduced to the most basic, most humiliating state, a helpless body that could not control its own functions, that had become an object of disgust, even to those paid to care for it. This was the end stage, the final degradation before death. Herod the Great, builder of monuments, conqueror of kingdoms, had become this, a rotting, stinking, convulsing mass of diseased flesh, barely recognizable as human. Yet still, he did not die. Day after day, his heart kept beating. His lungs kept drawing breath. His body, despite having failed in every other way, refused to give up its final spark of life. It was as if he were being kept alive deliberately, forced to endure every moment of this horror as punishment for his crimes. Religious observers saw divine justice in this prolonged suffering. How fitting, they said, that a man who had caused so much suffering should himself suffer so terribly. How appropriate that a tyrant who had executed his own children should die after executing his last remaining son. How symbolic that a man who had built monuments to his own glory should decay while still alive, his flesh rotting away while his consciousness remained trapped inside. Whether or not gods were involved, the poetic justice was undeniable. Herod's death mirrored his life, cruel, excessive, and ultimately empty. He had lived by violence and paranoia. Now he died by them, destroyed by his own fear-driven decision to kill Antipater, his body failing in spectacular, horrifying fashion. 5 more days. That was all that remained. 5 more days of suffering, and then, finally, release. The final hours. On what would be his last day of life, Herod's body began to show signs that the end was near. His extremities grew cold despite the warmth of his chambers. His skin took on a grayish-blue tinge, cyanosis, indicating that his heart could no longer pump blood effectively to his limbs. His breathing, which had been labored for days, became irregular. Periods of rapid, shallow breaths alternated with long pauses where he seemed not to breathe at all. These pauses grew longer, each one making the watchers think he had finally died, only for him to gasp and resume breathing. His eyes, which had been sunken and yellowed, began to glaze over. The physicians recognized these signs. They had seen death approach many times. They knew the pattern. This was the final stage. It could be hours, but probably not days. After months of suffering, Herod's ordeal was entering its final phase. Word spread through the palace that the king was dying. Servants whispered to each other. Family members gathered in the outer chambers, waiting. Political factions began positioning themselves for what would come next. The will had been changed so many times that no one was entirely certain who would inherit what. Archelaus seemed to be the primary beneficiary of the final version, but Herod had changed his mind so often that there was room for dispute. That dispute would lead to conflict after his death, with multiple claimants traveling to Rome to argue their cases before Augustus. But for now, they waited. They listened to the reports from the deathbed chamber. They heard that the king's breathing had changed, that his pulse was weakening, that the end was very close, and they prepared themselves for the transition of power, for the dangerous days ahead when the kingdom would be vulnerable. In his final hours, was Herod conscious? The sources are unclear. Some suggest he slipped into unconsciousness, finally released from awareness of his suffering. Others indicate he remained lucid to the end, trapped in full knowledge of what was happening. Perhaps the truth is somewhere between, moments of awareness alternating with periods of blessed oblivion. If he was conscious, what did he think about? Did his life flash before his eyes, as the cliché suggests happens to dying people? Did he see the faces of those he had killed, his wife Mariamne, his sons Alexander and Aristobulus, the countless others who had fallen victim to his paranoia? Did he feel remorse, fear, relief that it was finally ending, or was his mind too clouded by pain and toxins to think clearly about anything? We want to imagine some final moment of understanding, some recognition of the meaning of his life and death. But perhaps there was none. Perhaps he simply faded away, consciousness dissolving into confusion and then into nothing. The immediate aftermath of Herod's death was marked by a mixture of relief and uncertainty. His family members, who had been waiting in the outer chambers, now entered the death room. The smell was overwhelming, the accumulated stench of weeks of decay concentrated in one space. The sight was equally horrifying. Herod's body, which had been swollen and distended, now began to deflate somewhat as fluids settled and gases escaped. The skin, which had been stretched tight, now hung loose and discolored. The areas of gangrenous tissue were black and obviously dead. The face, barely recognizable as the man who had once commanded armies and built kingdoms, was a mask of suffering. Even in death, Herod looked agonized. His features were contorted, his mouth open in what might have been a final scream or gasp. The body was almost unrecognizable as human, so thoroughly had disease ravaged it. This was what remained of Herod the Great, a corrupted, stinking corpse that no one wanted to touch, much less mourn. Preparations for the funeral began immediately. Despite his condition, despite the horror of his appearance, Herod had planned an elaborate funeral procession. His body was to be carried to the Herodium, a fortress palace he had built about 12 kilometers from Jerusalem. There he would be entombed in a monument he had prepared for himself, one final building project, one last attempt at immortality. But first, the body had to be prepared for transport. Normally, bodies were washed and anointed with oils and spices, wrapped in linen. Herod's body was so decomposed that these procedures were difficult to perform. Servants who attempted to wash the corpse recoiled from the task. The smell was indescribable, even worse than when Herod had been alive. The flesh was so fragile that it fell away at the slightest touch. The embalmers did the best they could, using vast quantities of spices and aromatic substances to mask the odor, wrapping the body in multiple layers of linen to contain the corruption. But nothing could completely hide what Herod had become in death. The funeral procession itself was a spectacle, but not in the way Herod had intended. He had wanted a display of power and glory, a final demonstration of his greatness. Instead, it became a grotesque parade. The body was placed on a golden bier, carried by soldiers. Behind came the family, the court, the military. Musicians played funeral dirges. Professional mourners wailed and tore their clothes, performing the traditional expressions of grief. But everyone knew it was a farce. No one was actually mourning. The displays of sadness were purely formal, required by protocol, but utterly insincere. The people lining the route watched in silence, their faces showing relief rather than sorrow. Some openly smiled. The great tyrant was dead, and they were free of him. As the procession passed, people rushed into the streets not to mourn but to celebrate. The death of Herod was a liberation, not a tragedy. The procession arrived at the Herodium, and there Herod was interred in the tomb he had prepared. The exact location of this tomb remained a mystery for centuries. The Herodium had been identified, but the specific burial place was unknown. Then, in 2007, archaeologist Ehud Netzer announced the discovery of Herod's tomb during excavations at the site. The tomb had been deliberately destroyed in antiquity, smashed to pieces, probably during the Jewish revolt against Rome in 6670 CE. Even in death, Herod could not rest undisturbed. The monument he had built to ensure his memory would be preserved had been demolished, his remains scattered or destroyed. The man who had tried so hard to make himself immortal had been reduced to fragments of stone and bone. Nothing remained of his physical presence except ruins. Even his magnificent tomb, meant to awe visitors for generations, had been obliterated. In the end, all of Herod's building projects, all his political maneuvering, all his cruelty and ambition had failed to achieve what he most desired: remembrance and glory. He was remembered, certainly, but not as he had hoped. He was remembered for his cruelty, his paranoia, and his horrifying death, legacy of horror. Herod's death did not bring peace to Judea. His kingdom was immediately plunged into chaos as his sons fought over the succession. Archelaus, who had been named in the final will as primary heir, proved to be so incompetent and cruel that Augustus Caesar deposed him after just 10 years, exiling him to Gaul. The kingdom was divided among Herod's surviving sons, but none proved capable of holding it together. Within a few decades, Rome abolished the Herodian dynasty entirely, placing Judea under direct Roman rule with a procurator. The system of governance that Herod had built collapsed almost immediately after his death. His careful political arrangements, his alliances, his efforts to secure his legacy, all of it fell apart. The kingdom he had ruled for nearly 4 decades fragmented and disappeared. His greatest fear had come to pass. His legacy was failure. Herod was portrayed in early Christian literature as a villain, the murderer of innocent children, a man so evil that even his death was cursed by God. The story of the worms eating his genitals became a cautionary tale about the fate of tyrants. Medieval writers embellished the account, adding details that may or may not have been historical. The exact nature of his disease was debated. Was it divine punishment, or could it be explained through natural causes? Either way, the death became emblematic of a certain type of moral decline. The powerful brought low, the mighty humbled, the tyrant destroyed by the corruption that had defined his reign. Herod's death entered the cultural consciousness as the quintessential terrible death, the fate that awaited those who abused their power. Modern medical historians have attempted to diagnose Herod's condition based on the ancient descriptions. The consensus is that he suffered from multiple conditions simultaneously. Chronic kidney disease leading to uremia would explain the itching, the edema, and the altered mental state. Fournier's gangrene accounts for the rotting of his genital area and the maggot infestation. Cardiovascular disease might explain the fluid in his lungs and the breathing difficulties. Some scholars have suggested diabetes as an underlying condition that would predispose him to infections and poor wound healing. Others have proposed cancer, particularly of the kidney or bowel. The truth is probably that Herod had several serious conditions, each exacerbating the others, creating a cascade of system failures that led to his prolonged and agonizing death. What is clear from the medical analysis is that the ancient accounts are not exaggerations. Every symptom described is consistent with real medical conditions. Herod's death, as terrible as it sounds in the telling, was accurately reported.